Edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. This is our monthly race class with Jonathan Feingold. We're up to episode, I believe, 28, and I want to remind everyone that race class is taught with Jonathan Feingold. He's a teacher at Boston University Law School, and that we started doing this because we were concerned about legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities. It is spread across the country. We are therefore conducting once a month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. So let me welcome Jonathan back to the program for episode 28. And you entitled this Identity Politics and Playing Jewish Cards. And people are saying, wait a minute, Jonathan, this is race class. What's this Jewish card? So please do me a favor, connect the dots to why this is in fact relevant and appropriate for this class.
It's all relevant. Let me say, Arnie, it's really nice to be here with you. Yesterday, I had my final critical race theory class of the semester, and it was really wonderful to collectively with the students reflect on the past few months and everything that we've done, everything that they have done. And it's all connected. This thing that we do called race class is our little attempt to try to both model conversations, but then offer tools that we're all better equipped to think through a whole number of things that are one way or another connected with this deeply complex phenomenon called race or racism. And so it's all connected. And so the title, Identity Politics and Playing Jewish Cards, it's a play on this notion of the race card and identity politics, both terms that historically have been co-opted in ways to pejoratively, I think, to delegitimize and discredit racial justice efforts and claims that racism is real. And we're in this incredibly grotesque moment where it's like all of higher education has lost its mind, at least university presidents. A few months ago, we were reflecting on a very different sort of display at a same House committee that held a hearing with other university presidents involving spacious claims of anti-Semitism. And we saw a redux of that this past Wednesday, where the president of Columbia did not replicate what the presidents of Harvard and Penn had done, but threw academics under the bus, seemed to just parrot back mischaracterizations in what was, I think, deeply disturbing to increasing numbers of academics around the country. And then we saw the devastating overreaction, criminalization, calling it NYPD on college students, increasing calls for the National Guard to be deployed. And so for me, there's this moment where I feel like there's very little leadership out there in the media, in Congress, in the White House, who are offering any air support to just help people understand what's happening, see what's happening. And so the thing that I want to talk about today, just descriptively, just to describe some things, not to place moral judgment anywhere, but just to describe how Jewish identity is being mobilized by everyone, pretty much everyone, right now in order to engage in ideological combat.
Yes.
And so you ask, well, what's this have to do with critical race theory? We're theorizing race right now. We're theorizing how a social identity is being mobilized, activated in a particular moment in ways that almost everyone is engaged in, but it's often beneficial, helpful to have a vocabulary, a rubric, a taxonomy, just some categories so we can see and name what's happening. And then we're just better positioned to understand, respond in productive, responsible ways. I want to treat right now as class. So I have some thoughts. I think, identified seven different, I guess
Yeah.
eight. I'm looking at the
Yeah.
Google Doc. Eight different ways in which Jewish identity is being mobilized right now for very different ends. I just want to walk through those eight, we can call them moves,
Hmm.
get your reaction, because when you're thinking about categories analytically, it's really important that categories are doing at least two things. One, there's a clear distinction between what's in and what's out. Just you want clear boundaries,
Hmm.
um, and you don't want overlap between two different categories. Just for analytical precision, categories are most helpful. You got clear boundaries around them, and they're not overlapping. We don't want Venn diagrams because then analytically it's just not confusing, or it is confusing. It's not all that clear. And let me just offer a little backdrop, sort of setting this stage, and then ideally we have an hour for this conversation. I think we've got 18 more minutes. Let me set up some of the background. A, first point, just to get it out of the way, identity matters. Not necessarily the same way all the time, everywhere. The way in which identity matters, in this case, we're talking about Jewish identity, how it matters is contingent on the context, on the moment. That's the first point. Second point, our individual identities, as we are seeing in this moment, especially for anyone who identifies as Jewish, is inseparable from group membership. One sense of self at an individual level is tethered to the groups, the social identities that we view ourselves as being a part of. The third is that Jews, and really, I mean Ashkenazi Jews, or Jews who would be racialized, racially understood, at least in the American context, as white, have often in the United States occupied this liminal racial status, liminal, sort of in between a couple places. One, or on the one hand, anti-Semitism is always real. It's always out there. The way in which it's manifesting differs. And so that's precarity
Hmm.
that Jews face. But if you're Jewish, but racially in the American context, white, that means you enjoy many of the benefits and privileges that attach to whiteness. There's a similarity to South and East Asians, not racialized as white, but still enjoy a proximity to whiteness and in particular domains. It's almost an insider and outsider status at the same time. But where you are, in what context matters. And then, and this last point is also important, the power of one's identity, the efficacy of foregrounding one, like a particular identity in a particular moment, comes from these common sense notions we have regarding who has the authority to speak on a particular issue.
Hmm.
And so someone is Jewish, foregrounding that aspect of their identity is going to often do more work when the thing we're talking about is about Jewish stuff as opposed to something else. And we should have a long conversation about why we might actually be anxious about overvaluing identity as a proxy, or over sort of understanding it as a proxy for authenticity or authority. Olufemi Taiwo, who's a philosopher at Princeton, has written a lot about this. Maybe one day we can bring him on, but we don't have time for that because I want to get to the moves and I want to hear your reactions. And I'm going to split the moves into sort of two broad categories. One, people who identify as Jewish, foregrounding that Jewish identity for particular reasons, and then people who are not necessary, who do not identify as Jewish, but mobilizing Jewish identity. And so we'll start with individuals who identify as Jewish, mobilizing, foregrounding their Jewish identity for different purposes. And I have essentially three in both categories. I guess four in the former category, and then four in the latter. So, and I've got a name for all of these, each of these, and the names are important. And so you should let me know if the name
All
doesn't
right.
really work.
Hit me.
First move.
Yep.
This is what I'm going to refer to as the comrade. And I'm a law professor. So a lot of my examples, at least, will have to do with sort of university life. Imagine you are a Jewish member of a faculty, and you are concerned that the campus environment, for whatever reason right now, is one in which Jewish students, your students who you care deeply about, rightly so, are more likely than normal to face hostility on campus because of their Jewishness. That might lead you to more intentionally and actively signal your membership within the group, whether it's by putting a mezuzah up on your door, whether it's by wearing a Star of David around your neck or wearing a kippah. And the reason you're doing it is to try to create a more inviting, a warmer campus environment for others in your group. So it's the comrade.
Mm-hmm.
And you could think of variations on it for folks who aren't in the group, but want to nonetheless signal solidarity or support. And so in other contexts, it would be something like putting up a Black Lives Matter sign or a pride flag in one's office or one's room.
What you're almost conveying is that this is a safe space for you. So it's kind of like you're connecting them to this idea that this is a safe space. I, however, am not Jewish, but I would love to have my Jewish friends know that this is a safe space for them, but it's also a safe space for Palestinians. So I don't know what box I fit into. It's a safe space to have a conversation, is what I'm trying to say. And yet what you're telling me is, again, this identity, and you're saying now you're sharing this identity in order to tell your students, at least if nothing else, understand, I know who you are, I know who I am, and there is a connection to us, i.e. the comrade.
There's lots of ways in which we can spin all this out, but it's someone who's has concerns about how students might subjectively experience the campus and want to insulate their students from sort of negative experiences by foregrounding the fact that I am part of this group. And so you can proudly also be part of this group. That's the comrade. Very different mobilization of Jewish identity is the next one I'm moving to, which I refer to as the sword. And this is individuals or entities that are foregrounding Jewish identity to assert an authoritative perspective, to claim an authoritative perspective, and to discredit competing viewpoints, both from within and without the Jewish community. And so I see what the ADL, American Defamation League, Anti-Defamation League, has been doing is sort of using Jewish identity as a sword.
Yes.
To delegitimize broadly criticism of Israel and Israeli policy. And part of that is a fight over who is an authentic and authoritative Jewish voice. Because a lot of what I view as attacks, rhetorical attacks from ADL, have been directed at what you would generally think of as sort of left-wing or more progressive Jews. And so I would just, as one example, from in October, this past October, on the 18th, there was a protest of Jewish rabbis calling for ceasefire.
Right.
And an ADL director of their DC office referred to these rabbis as far left radicals who do not represent the majority of the Jewish community. And again, part of what we're doing is just describing different ways in which identity is mobilized in a moment for various ends. And so, no, jump in, go ahead.
All right, so is the ADL sort of creating this hierarchy of Jewishness? So that if you don't fit into their hierarchy, then you are a lesser Jew, and therefore they're defining you. You are the better Jew. You are the more authentic Jew. You are the lesser Jew. And you know the reason I bring this up? I used to live in Minnesota. I adored Paul Wellstone. Paul Wellstone was Jewish. Paul Wellstone ran against a fellow Jew, Rudy Boschwitz. Do you know what Rudy Boschwitz said about Paul Wellstone? He wasn't a good Jew because he married a shiksa. He married a non-Jew. So it created the idea of hierarchy. I am your better Jew. He is your lesser Jew, which turned out in Minnesota to offend a lot of Jews. And in part, Paul Wellstone got the support. But again, this is on a much more micro kind of scale, not as toxic as the one we're seeing with the ADL, but it is not uncommon for people to sort of establish this hierarchy. I'm a better Christian. I'm a better Jew. And now with what's going on, the ADL is basically sort of marginalizing and using this as, in this case, as an incredible sword, because they really are setting up this pecking order. And some people have a right to speak. And in some ways, what the ADL says is you don't have a right to speak.
Well, and here's how I'll respond. So it's important to remember that a lot of what is being contested right now is what is and what is not anti-Semitism. And so the ADL, they're very clear in this tweet that I just referenced. They say explicitly, this person says, let's be very clear, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And then if we connect that to again, this common sense logic that many of us have, that the individuals or entities that are part of the group that are the target of the harm have greater authority to speak to whether, like, what is, or I guess just to put it very plainly, there's a common sense logic that if you are Jewish, you have more authority to identify what is and what is not anti-Semitism. Right. And so part of the fight is over who can claim an authentic Jewish voice or perspective, or an authoritative Jewish voice or perspective. And I am not right now saying that anyone has that. To the contrary, the critical race theorist observation would be that individuals who identify as Jewish are incredibly diverse, heterogeneous in all sorts of different ways, and have different conceptions of what anti-Semitism is. And in moments of deep political conflict, there will often be efforts to discredit competing viewpoints through different means. Now, I want to sort of flip to a different move that is sort of one can think of it as the opposite of the sword, which is the shield. And this is someone who is foregrounding identity. In this case, we're talking about Jewish identity, in order to defend against the claims that a particular perspective is illegitimate. And so you can think of progressive Jewish organizations like If Not Now, that have been repeatedly calling for ceasefire and have been foregrounding their Jewishness and their Jewish identity through rhetoric such as "not in our name." I'm not suggesting that it is not earnest. I think it likely is all earnest, but it is also likely aware, cognizant that there is greater sort of public credibility cachet to say "not in our name" than to be an outsider and saying "not in their name," in part because it is pushing back against an entity like the ADL's attempt to define a contested claim or to have the authority to do so. Or you've got this Columbia PhD student, Jonathan Ben Menachem, who just wrote an op-ed in which he is in part foregrounding not just his Jewish identity, but the Jewish identity of many Jewish students on campus who, among other things, were having a Seder this week to celebrate Passover on the grounds of Columbia in solidarity with Jews and non-Jews, Palestinians, and others who are protesting, among other things, Israel's ongoing military assault on Gaza and other occupied territories, in which, like, the news feed remains horrific on what is actually happening there. But this is, and right now, especially since October 7th, my instinct is that many Jewish Americans who are very concerned current Israeli policy and practices have been foregrounding their Jewish identity in a way they might not with other issues because of the way in which Israel is conceptually tethered, is practically tethered to Jewishness. It's a moment in which the claim is a claim as an insider, as about one's own family, then as an outsider, which we tend to understand differently. And so it's a shield, it's foregrounding identity to defend the legitimacy of one's claim, as opposed to a sword, foregrounding identity to assert a singular authoritative position and to delegitimize another's claim.
Can you refresh my recollection? Is part of the issue as well is that every Jew in the world, if they come to Israel, automatically becomes a citizen of Israel. I'm half Italian, but if I go to Italy, I'm not a citizen of Italy. I'm half Norwegian. If I go to Norway, I'm not. There's a gatekeeping function. But given the nature of the Jewish state, given the nature of the formation of the Jewish state, given this idea that this is the sort of safe place for all Jews, is part of the issue too, that every Jew in the world is perceived to have two allegiances, that they are perceived to be an American or Brit or French, but they also, as soon as they return or come to Israel, there's this idea that they have another status. Does that also complicate the situation? Am I accurate in my understanding? I just need to ask because there's a piece of me that's still trying to figure out how do you separate, and yet at the same time, you talked about overlapping of identity, but to a large extent, almost by definition, Israel by definition overlaps identity.
Yes, Israel by definition overlaps identity in different sorts of ways. But again, our modest goal right now is just to identify different ways in which identity gets mobilized. And in this moment, Jewish identity is being mobilized in order to essentially spar over competing ideological positions or viewpoints, and invites much longer conversations about the way in which identity is mobilized in different contexts and who has the ability at what time to speak with an authoritative voice. And then the sorts of claims that you see get thrown at, for example, progressive Jews. The question is, well, like, are they really all that Jewish?
Exactly.
And it's so we only have a couple of minutes, so I just want to get to a different move. And this is from someone who is not Jewish. This is who I'm referring to as the Cynic. That might be too generous. And this is someone or an entity that instrumentally, opportunistically weaponizes rhetorical claims about concerns about anti-Semitism to further political agendas that at their core have no interest, are unconcerned in the safety or well-being of Jewish Americans. And the House committee stuff, Virginia Fox, Elise Stefanik, the nakedly cynical turn to anti-Semitism in that space is one thing, but I saw today that Mike Johnson, the House Majority Leader, is going to visit Colombia in order to quote unquote, meet with Jewish students regarding concerns about anti-Semitism. It is hard in the Rolodex of American politicians to find someone who is less concerned with actual, like, meaningful precarities and vulnerabilities that Jewish Americans face on a daily basis than Mike Johnson. And he is sending out press releases about how he's making his pilgrimage to Colombia.
And again, he has his cover because of what he just recently did with the money being spent now in defense of Ukraine, in defense of Israel, in defense of Asian countries. So again, in some ways, he's saying, see, look what I've done. And now whether you trust him or not, he can sort of use that as his bridge to then have the legitimacy to go to Colombia. On that note, so guess what, Mr. Feingold, you're coming back, but not in a month. You're coming back sooner than that because we have to talk about this. because it is so fractious. Everything is so difficult, and it's difficult to have a conversation. And you've been able to conduct a conversation, and we need to continue this. So I'm going to invite you back, and I'm not going to wait a month. So be prepared.
Well, if I come back, it's going to be with not just me, because it's important to note that one of the goals of the sorts of really McCarthyist committee hearings that we're seeing is to blacklist academics.
Yes. And you will come with you will come with other players. Episode 28, Identity Politics and Playing the Jewish Card. We've been talking with Professor Jonathan Feingold from Boston